What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Uncensored Critic podcast. Thank you for tuning in again. As always, I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that. Today, we welcome along to the show a man who helped me actually through my A-level English during the Gothic times, not a Gothic phase of my life. We studied Gothic literature. So this man was on our classroom screens. We saw his lectures and who helped us through that time. And it's a real pleasure to welcome along today Mr. David Punter. David holds a BA, MA and PhD from Fitzwilliam College. I hope I pronounced that right, in Cambridge. He is the professor of poetry at Bristol University. Not only is he a poet, but he is an expert on the Gothic and has worked at universities in the UK as well as China. He's made appearances in London at the Barbican, as well as universities in Norwich, York, Bristol and Denmark. And he was longlisted for the Poetry Society's annual competition and shortlisted for the Brian Dempsey Memorial Prize. A long list of academic publications on William Blake, cultural studies, Phillip Larkin, Post-Modernism and Post-Colonialism. And specifically for the Gothic genre, he has written books, countless books, but some of the titles here are The Literature of Terror, Gothic Pathologies, The Text, the Body and the Law, A Companion to the Gothic, with Dennis Byron for Blackwell in 2004, and The Gothic Tradition, Terror, History and the Psyche, amongst many, many others. And for more information about his poetry and his writings, you can find on his website, davidpunter.org. Link is down below in the description. So without further ado, David, hello.
Hello, Oliver. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
And you, how are you?
I'm very well. Yes, I'm going to be much better next week because I gather that summer is coming back briefly for a few days. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, we've had a very fleeting summer this year. It's kind of come and gone very quickly, hasn't it?
Very confusing, very confusing. But then the weather is very confusing in general at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are people who say that's because of climate change.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And frankly, I think they're completely right.
That's a whole other conversation. But I always look at the writers. You've studied so many, from the poets to everyone. The pathetic fallacy. God, my A-level English coming back now. They use the weather a lot in their text and everything. So they might have used this kind of. I don't know. What would you think of Bram Stoker or Mary Shelley seeing the weather, particularly over here in the UK? They must have written even more than what they wrote with Dracula and Frankenstein.
It may be so. I mean, certainly the Gothic writers, certainly the early ones in particular, used the pathetic fallacy enormously. I mean, where would we be with Frankenstein, and especially the films of Frankenstein, without thunder and lightning and enormous raindrops and general interference in the normal processes of life? Because that's what Gothic is about. I mean, it's about interference with the normal processes of life, however one sees those.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we start with the starter question for every guest. I'm sure we're going to talk more about Frankenstein and all that stuff today, as well as Dracula. But if we shoot right back to the beginning, David. So the first time you fell in love with literature and poetry and art and writings and all things literature, where did it all come from?
Well, that is a very challenging question. It's always been there with me, I think. I guess it goes. I guess, and you may well agree with this, Oliver. As many of us, it goes back to an early teacher of English at my school. I think that teachers of English are famous or possibly notorious for carrying their enthusiasm over to their pupils. This man, I'll name him, though I think he's now long gone, but his name was Geoffrey Thornton. But hey, Jeff, wherever you are now, I hope it's going okay. He enthused me for literature. He also made me very enthusiastic about not believing in God, because he was the only teacher with a special permission from the headmaster to remain seated during morning assembly when others stood to sing the hymns.
Oh, right. Interesting stuff. So was there a particular, do you remember the first moment or the first novel you read or the first piece of literature that you read that made you go, I want to delve into this, I want to get more into this stuff?
Oh, goodness me. Well, probably first it was poetry, and
Mm,
I guess just picking a name almost out of a hat, it would have been T.S. Eliot,
mm,
and trying to grapple with the fact that when I first read The Wasteland, I had no idea what he was on about. But I think there's something here that I want to understand. And I
mm.
think that gripped me. Whether now I understand it, I'm not at all sure, but I've certainly spent a number of years trying to understand. I think that was my first experience of the joy of literature and also the difficulty of literature.
Mm. Yeah, because I think we could touch on the poetry actually first before we sort of delve into the Gothic. But so what is it about? I mean, when you're reading, like I suppose anyone who's listening to this or watching this who's having trouble with a particular poem, like a T.S. Eliot or a Tennyson or something like that, so what advice would you say if you're reading a poem which you're really really like, it's hard to understand at first? What advice would you give to people to unlock it? So, like, how did you unlock T.S. Eliot, do you think?
Well, I think that we often get hung up on trying to understand the form, the shape of the poetry,
Mm,
and that's enormously important. But I think the way into most poetry is through the images. Look at this poem and say to yourself, this image, whether it's an image of a butterfly or a ruined city or whatever it or a person, whatever it might be, if this image is somehow gripping me, is somehow getting to me, then I want to understand what's going on there, how the writer is doing this, and what
mm,
it is in me that makes me gripped by this image. I think that's the thing. With Eliot, I always remember there's a line, uh, the wounded surgeon plies the steel. And I kept thinking, what on earth is that about? Why is the surgeon wounded? What is going on here? And as I just said, I'm not even sure now that I quite understand, but the
yeah.
image absolutely gripped me, and I felt I wanted to know more from that point.
Yeah. So, which poet would you say inspired you to write your own stuff? Because I know you write your own poetry. You've got your own anthologies and things like that. Who was your biggest inspiration, do you think?
Well, I write poetry of various different kinds. I published a book 2 or 3 years ago of political poetry with Palewell Press, and the inspiration for that was certainly W.H. Auden.
Hmm.
Um, but I should say to our viewers that, of course, poetry has changed immeasurably over the last decades. The tradition in which I was brought up was entirely white poetry, uh, mostly male poetry. There were exceptions. Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich and so forth, even in my early days, were very well known and respected poets. But the order of things was very much about a poetic tradition and a poetic English language tradition. And of course, now poetry has become hugely more diverse. There's wonderful performance poetry around, wonderful rap poetry around. Um, all manner of different influences are coming to bear on poetry now. And that is wonderful. I mean, poetry is now such a diverse field. I have to say that during lockdown, I did have one or two moments of despair
Hmm.
because so many people seem to be writing such good poetry that I wondered whether I should even continue to bother. But that's the field is now very broad, and the cross influences between different kinds and genres of poetry uh, are very, very vibrant, and that's a wonderful thing. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure it's true of other cities and even smaller towns in the UK. But now, if I wanted to go to a poetry reading every night of the week in Bristol,
Mm.
which I don't because I also have a life, but if I did, then I could easily do that and still feel I was missing out on 2/3 of the city's poetry scene.
Absolutely. That two-thirds, there's something, there's a gem in every single one of them, isn't there? Um, so when it comes to, because when we looked at Tennyson, I think for my A levels and stuff, we studied Ulysses and Lady of Shalott and everything. And there's a particular, the imagery that Tennyson uses, I think, is particularly striking. Is he up there with some of your favorites?
Um, Uh, yes and no. Tennyson, like any great poet, has many aspects.
Mm,
Um, you mentioned Lady of Shalott, and I think that's a very memorable poem, because it has those images. It has that one concentrated image that either draws you in or it repels you. One can't be sure.
mm,
Um, Others of Tennyson's poems I find are so embedded in a kind of Victorian culture and mentality
mm,
that I can't do much with them. The Charge of the Light Brigade, I mean, we have so many different perspectives now on warfare and so forth. Coming back to Eliot for a moment, he described Tennyson as a poet wholly encrusted by tradition. And
mm,
I think that is true. And it's become even more obviously true as time has gone on. I think the thing about Lady of Shalott is that it's essentially lyrical. It sings to you.
it
And I
does.
think Tennyson can sing, and that's great when he sings.
Mm,
Other times he gets bogged down and he forgets to sing and he just is constructing these very elaborate sort of poetic buildings, this kind of poetic architecture.
mm,
And I don't find that terribly gripping.
mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Eliot also writes he writes his plays as of like Long Day's Journey into Night and all that kind of thing. But it's almost like that the poetry, and I'm a big lover of Harold Pinter as well. And Pinter's sort of a poet, and that fed into his playwriting. And so it's almost like you're not reading a play, you're reading a poem as a result, because and it flows naturally in the conversation because poetry sort of comes from that natural kind of beats in normal conversation and normal kind of the rhythm of which we speak and the tones we use and everything. So it's like, could you class like poetry, like a play as a poem and a play and the other way around, do you think?
Well, I remember as a schoolboy taking part in a performance of Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral.
Mm,
Um, I didn't enjoy Eliot's plays terribly much, uh, but I think if we're talking about the ability to create crisp language, then yes, I think that drama and poetry have a lot in common, as opposed to, for example, the much more expansive form of the novel. Yes, I think there is something in that. If you think of Beckett's plays,
mm,
then Waiting for Godot is the best known, but there are many others.
mm.
Then I do think that when you see them on the page, and you're an actor, Oliver, aren't you?
I
I'm
am,
aware of.
yes. I
Yeah,
am, yeah.
yeah. Well, I think you can see that those lines can be acted, but they can also almost be, yes, they can be read as a kind of continuing poem. I think that is true of some kinds of, and of course, the great model of the uh, collusion between poetry and drama remains Shakespeare,
Mm,
where so many lines from Shakespeare's plays have become seen as lines of poetry themselves. And of course, Shakespeare, as well as being a dramatist, was also uh, I was going to say a great poet. I'm not sure. I think he's a very good poet. I mean, I think that the sonnets, which I recently reread, actually,
mm,
I read through the whole lot. I'm not quite sure why I did that, or what else I was not doing while I was doing it, but I did. And I thought, as some other critics have said, that there are uh, a dozen or perhaps 2 dozen of those sonnets which are absolutely heart-stopping. Um, but a lot of them are very good, uh, very good crafting of words without necessarily being emotionally accessible. Some
mhm.
of the sonnets are very complicated in terms of where you're meant to go with the words and with the lines. Um, and of course, most people read them with annotations, and I think that's entirely reasonable. And I do myself. There are some things I can't quite follow from 16th century language. Well, why should one be able to?
Exactly.
So yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, I don't know all the sonnets, but sonnet one is no 118. Yeah, I think that's the right one. So, love is not love, which alters where alteration finds. Is that 118?
You're putting me on the spot here. I haven't got my copy to hand with the numbers. And of course, one of the interesting things about Shakespeare's sonnets is that trying to remember them is quite difficult because none of them have names, none have titles. That they've all just numbered, and not numbered by Shakespeare, just numbered by huge numbers of successive editors of Shakespeare who have tried to form this body of work into something intelligible and memorable.
Yeah.
But you're probably right.
Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, so when it comes to form and all that kind of thing, there's so many different forms of poetry. There's enjambment, there's personification, and everything. And I think some people, I think, remember the first thing we started with is how it's written. Is it written in verse, or is it written? Is it blank verse? Is it, and all these different things. So, would you mind just sort of what's the word, not deconstruct, yeah, deconstructing like the various forms of which like poetry is written, and what people can, and why it's written in that way, do you think?
Wow, that is a huge question. Um, oh, uh, I just mentioned the sonnet
Mm,
because the sonnet is a form which will be with us for 400 years or so.
yeah.
14 lines, grouped in various different ways, all the same line length, uh, 10 syllables. Yeah. Uh, Rhyming in various different schemes. So that the sonnet is a classic formula kind of poem. There are other poetic formulas, some of them very old, like for example the villanelle, an old Provençal form which involves a number of stanzas with lines at the end of each three-line stanza, which then repeat alternately down the page. And there are many others. And those forms, I suppose, dominated poetry in English from the 16th to the late 19th, early 20th century, which is when you start to get poetry written which moves away from those forms and moves beyond those forms.
Mm,
And you get poetry which is written in irregular line lengths. And at the time, that was called free verse.
hmm.
Uh, I think most poetry now is written in a kind of free verse, which doesn't overemphasize rhythm and rhyme, except interestingly that rap, although it's seen as very innovatory, and in some ways it is also a move back to those roots because rap relies entirely on rhyme and rhythm.
Mm.
Get a rhythm going. You talk about the constellation. You talk about your innovation. And you're going on with rhyming throughout at a rapid pace. And the rhythm to rap is absolutely essential. So in some ways, I would argue that rap is the most traditional kind of poetry we have at the moment.
Mm, excellent. There's all kinds of things sort of going through my head now. But when you sit down, do you still write poetry? Do you still sort of dabble with that? Because I know you've written quite a lot. Have you got any new ideas in your head?
I do still write poetry, and I publish poetry, and I've published. Oh, am I allowed to say this?
Yeah,
Yes, I am. Why
yeah,
not?
of
You can
course.
always edit it out. I published three
Mhm.
collections in the last 4 years. The first one was called Those Other Fields, and that's a collection of political poetry published by Palewell Press. And then I published a book called Stranger with Cinnamon Press, which are there's no real theme or style or form to which unites that book. They're
Yeah.
just poems. And then last year I published a book called Ship's Log, which was a collection inspired by the great ship, the SS Great Britain. I won't bore you with the history of the SS Great Britain now, but it's now a museum moored in Bristol Harbour, and the museum has an archive attached. and the archive contains reams and reams of letters and diaries written and kept by passengers. And so I spent some time reading through those. I found some amazing extracts, especially of people who were trying to understand and get to grips with and write about their experience of being at sea. Many of these people had never seen the sea before in their lives. And there they were, suddenly bound for Australia. Sometimes because they were going there for work, or sometimes because they were going there even though they didn't want to. And there were many, many reasons. I found those extracts, and I thought some of them were just marvelously written. And so I wrote poems in response to those extracts. So that's the book Ship's Log. So I'm a fairly diverse kind of poet, I think.
Oh, great. So where do you start with poetry? So you sit down, you've got a blank piece of paper. What's the first thing that you do? What's the first thing in your head?
It varies sometimes, and I think the best times it starts with a phrase, sentence, or something like that, which you don't do anything with, but you find that it's going on round in your head, and you think, why? A bit like what I said about images just now. Why is this going round in my head? What is it that is gripping me? Might it grip other people? And then I think you do have to sit about and let it expand, and then maybe a few more lines will come. And after that, I often find that a form will come, so that it turns out that the poem wants to be written in triplets, 3-line stanzas, or wants to be written in a longer kind of stanza structure, or and that does seem to emerge. I mean, I'm not a super romantic in terms of saying that poetry writes itself. That's not true. A lot of hard work in writing poetry. But I do think that sometimes poems suggest that they should be in a particular kind of form. I almost never sit down and say, I am going to write a sonnet, or I'm going to write a villanelle, or whatever it is. I have done it once or twice, and it's not been hugely successful, I think, to be honest.
Oh, there you go. That's great. I mean, it's all these, I suppose there's like there's no limit on what you can talk about with poetry. It's everything. Every subject matter on this planet is covered in any famous or non-famous writer. It's quite incredible, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Yes. You'll recall, of course, it was the poet Thomas Gray, wasn't it, who spoke of mute, inglorious Miltons. In other words, he meant people who wrote or just thought poetry that we'll never ever know about, but who, it might have been as good as Milton. But does it matter? I mean, if we're all engaged in writing and thinking in poetical ways, then maybe we're taking a bit of a break from thinking in, what's the opposite of the poetic? The instrumental.
Yeah.
Instrumental ways in which we are trying to organize the world around us for us. With poetry, you're not really quite doing that. You're trying to think on a broader canvas, I think, or things.
Yeah.
I'm getting vague there, but something like.
Yeah. Who's your favorite poet?
My favorite poet. Oh my word, Blake, William Blake.
Yeah. I wish I knew. I wish I knew more of his work, but something to do in the next few days. Cool. So yeah, thank you for that. So let's jump into sort of the main body of your work, which of course is Gothic literature. You said there, like it's always been with you, like this literature, and then somehow you got like this phrase in your head, and it's always there, and you're thinking, what does this mean? What does this mean? So when did Gothic come into your head, and what made you want to sort of really get to grips with this genre?
Well, there are two ways to answer that. I mean, the first is that Gothic is all about fear, and indeed, I think anxiety. And I think that looking back on it, I think that my fascination with the Gothic was because it seemed to speak to some of those fears that couldn't be expressed in everyday life. That's one way of looking at it, which is essentially psychological. The other way of looking at it is more practical, which is that I was as a young academic, I knew quite a lot about 18th and 19th century literature, and I was looking for a field which hadn't been fully explored before. And I found, this is way back now in the late 1970s, that nobody had written a decent book about the Gothic. It simply wasn't well known at that time. This may seem strange now because the Gothic is now a major category of literary study. There are MAs in the Gothic all over the country, and of course Gothic as an interest in literature and more especially now, I suppose, in film and in video games is all around us. And of course, we now live with a goth culture. I don't say we're all members of that culture, but there is indeed a goth culture. It comes and goes. I think it waxes and wanes. Sometimes I see more goths on the streets of Bristol than other times, but it's still definitely there. So it's now become a feature, if only a minor feature, of popular culture and of youth culture. But at that time in the 70s, it really wasn't at all well known. But I thought there's something to be said here because the Gothics had many, many manifestations. The central literary manifestation, what's often referred to as the Gothic novel, occurs in the mid to late 18th century, starting with Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto in the 1760s, and then moving on to Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis and many others in the last decade of the 18th century. And then perhaps leading into works like Frankenstein in the early 19th century. So that's the kind of heartland of Gothic. But of course, Gothic has many more manifestations than that. You have the Gothic revival in the 19th century in architecture and in art. You have Gothic, as I've said, proceeding to the present day, but with a real recrudescence in the later part of the 19th century with Stoker's Dracula, H.G. Wells, Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray. So you have a long, long history. And I thought maybe it'd be possible to do a study and to write a book which traced those Gothic elements through from that early Gothic through to through to what was then the present day in the title of my book, The Literature of Terror, but of course was actually the 1980s. The present day has moved on, I discover.
Oh, yeah. But there's something about, actually, just going off that, one question I had for you was, do you think Gothic, I mean, obviously I think this might be self-explanatory anyway, but do you think, is it timeless or is it of its time, do you think?
I think that nothing is timeless, or at least very little is timeless. Maybe death is timeless. Maybe pain is timeless. Maybe birth is timeless. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a bit metaphysical here. No,
Yeah,
I don't think
but they're traits of the Gothic, though. It's interesting.
Well, I think the Gothic changes and adjusts itself over the years and indeed over the centuries. One of the main fears of the early Gothics was actually essentially social or political. It was about whether the revolutions against feudal and aristocratic domination had succeeded or not, or whether somehow that aristocratic order would return. Now that was obviously a very important feature at the time of life in Europe, and especially in the light of the French Revolution and events surrounding that. Those issues don't concern us directly anymore. But it's interesting that Edgar Allan Poe most of his short stories, he sets them in a kind of aristocratic feudal Europe. The Mask of the Red Death, to take one example, is set in the palace of somebody he refers to as Duke Prospero. And then if we come on to a much more recent and a wonderful writer, Angela Carter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in most of her stories in The Bloody Chamber and in some of her novels, then she is again going back to those old Gothic tropes about the castle, the mustachioed aristocratic villain. She does, of course, a lot in terms of older folk stories as well. But that aspect of the Gothic, oddly enough, I think has never quite gone away. And we could also think about the long sequence of Hammer horror films, where the settings are also often totally displaced from any contemporary world and set back in a feudal past.
Yeah, and I think another one is Susan Hill, which she could probably count as a Gothic writer as well, particularly with The Woman in Black.
I think so. Absolutely, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Good example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for anyone who's studying Gothic or is just interested in it, there's just like these sort of stereotypical tropes of it. Really, you've got this. I think Tom Hiddleston gave an interview because he did a film called Crimson Peak, which was dubbed as Gothic. He said that there's a radiant, pure-hearted heroine, female heroine, and she's drawn to the tall, dark stranger with a crumbling mansion on the hill, and basically it's almost like I mean this is Tom's words, not mine. It's almost like she's Elizabeth Bennet, I'm Mr. Darcy, and when it gets back to the house, it just some crazy shit just happens as a result. And it's interesting about because the Gothic has like these images of like you talk about dungeons and you talk about monasteries, and I think Pan's Labyrinth is a good example of that kind of darkness and echoiness and the emptiness and the void. What sort of, I mean, what attracts you to sort of that, to the Gothic, and what makes those settings, those landscapes specific to the Gothic?
Well, I mean, in addition to the examples that you very rightly suggested, of course, there's also Wuthering Heights, which plays out the same kind of intense attraction between Catherine and Heathcliff. I think that one thing the Gothic does is pay attention to our everyday emotions of love, fear, whatever it might be, but to exaggerate them, to call attention to something uncontrollable in our feelings.
Mm.
Now, in the traditional English novel, well, whatever that is, anyway, in some traditional English novels, then it is as though we have to be in a world where our feelings can be controlled, that we have to function as members of an organic, flourishing society. And that involves repressing some things. And of course, I'm now alluding here to Freud on repression. And I think that some Freudian explanations about these things are very valuable. I won't go into that at the moment. But in the Gothic, you see a certain kind of florid display of these emotions, these passions that we otherwise hold in check. Now, whether that is well, I think it's a kind of outlet for feelings that often don't have any other kind of outlet. Mm-hmm. And those passions and those feelings can be positive sometimes, but usually they carry with them a fear of some kind of destruction. I'm thinking of what now I suppose is called dark romanticism. It's interesting that on bookshop shelves you never I've never found a shelf called Gothic.
Mm.
What you do find is dark fantasy or dark romanticism and so forth. But I think these are, broadly speaking, the same thing. It's just that the Gothic sounds a bit old-fashioned, whereas
Mm.
dark romanticism sounds much more up to date and to do with feelings that we have. And of course, some of those feelings are not positive at all. And I think again of Goth culture, where there was an emphasis on uh, doom, on doomed love, on
Mm.
love that never. I'm thinking of a film like Last Lovers Left Alive, and wonderful film, and it's suffused with this doom and gloom about how we can know. And I would say that that does have, in terms of Goth culture, I think there is a connection between Goth culture as contemporarily uh, regarded and adolescence, because I think that there is a sense in Goth culture and also in the original Gothics of an essential inherent goodness, as you say, the young ladies floating about in a state of fear and in a white nightdress. These are people whose essential goodness is never recognized. And I expect you remember, don't you, Oliver? I certainly do, that
Mm.
feeling in adolescence that there was a good person inside here, or even, I don't know, a strong person or something, but
Mm.
somehow the outside of you didn't tell that story.
Yeah.
Um, because it was covered in acne, or I don't mean you, but because it represent itself to the outside world in the way that you wanted it to. And so you had this intense inner life, which never quite intersected with the outside. And I think that the Gothic has always had something to do with that, with a notion of the inner life, which can't quite make its way to the surface or be recognized in the normal
Mm.
world.
Yeah, because I think I was just thinking there, like the two words that kind of stick out now is like repression and manipulation, in a way. You know, there's manipulation of the heroine. There's a repression of just the natural feelings as you were talking about there, and also repression of safety as well, because there's a lot of danger in this genre as well. Would those be two words to associate with the Gothic as well, particularly like manipulation and of characters?
I hadn't quite thought of manipulation. I certainly agree with repression, and I
Mm.
think issues of safety are really very important. Although I think I have, on the whole, referred to that. So I think I'm talking about the same thing here
Mm.
as questions of vulnerability.
Yes.
The Gothic maiden, our fear as we read the early Gothic novels is that this vulnerability is somehow going to be violated. It very rarely is. I mean, in fact, I don't think it ever is in the early novels. That gets worse, gets more dangerous later on as Gothic moves on. But I
Mm.
think it's that anxiety about vulnerability, and I think that where the novels and indeed many recent films engage our audience attention is in that anxiety about, will this particular character survive the night?
Yeah.
Of course, that's the essential plot of all the hundreds of teen Scream movies, which have been all around us for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
These will these vulnerable teenage girls survive? Interestingly, there's a phenomenon a number of my colleagues have written about recently called the final girl, where
Hmm.
it seems that everybody doesn't survive the night except for one girl who does survive and lives to tell the tale. Um, Quite what that means, I'm not certain, except that, of course, if she hadn't survived, there wouldn't be any tale to tell.
Yeah.
Somebody has to survive.
Yeah. Otherwise, you
Mm.
wouldn't have a story.
No, another story.
Exactly. There's a big, I think this part of your research is looking at particularly like the roles of that gender plays in the Gothic, particularly how males are presented and females are presented in a way. And I think there's this sort of the gender roles in the Gothic are quite, I don't want to say, I don't think stereotypical in a way, and I don't mean to sound bad now or anything, like the men are strong and the women are weak, and I'm not saying that at all, but in the Gothic that seems to be presented in that way, and I think that sparks a lot of debate when it comes to gender roles in this genre.
Yeah. Well, yes, you're quite right. There's no way of avoiding that in the early days of the Gothic. Yes, it is vulnerable girls and powerful men. The only thing one might say about that is that in the end of most Gothic novels, the powerful older men, the patriarchy,
Mm.
almost never succeeds.
Mm.
Uh, but in the end, it is a kind of patriarchal story because the girl eludes the menace of the older man, but not by herself, but by forming a liaison, normally a marriage, with a younger, eligible man. I mean that's the plot of all of Anne Radcliffe's novels. It's a plot that continues, right down the right down the years. So uh, I think that until recently, I'm afraid it has to be said that the Gothic is a child of its various ages during the 18th, 19th centuries. It is a form that accepts patriarchy, but I do think that it often does criticize it, and it does reduce the patriarchy and punish it for its own crimes. And I'm thinking here, for example, of a very early Gothic novel, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, where
Yeah.
there is an evil monk, who does all sorts of terrible things, and including rape and so forth. But at the end of the novel, he goes down to hell. So it doesn't prove a kind of patriarchal success story. Rather, it challenges patriarchy. And I think that the female figures in Gothic, and you mentioned Susan Hill just now, and I mentioned Angela Carter, the female figures have grown more powerful as Gothic has gone on. And Gothic has proved itself a very malleable genre, I think. But also it's picked up on older folk traditions where, of course, folk stories are not always patriarchal stories. There are powerful witches. There
Yeah.
are enchantresses. That there are women whose power cannot be challenged. And again, Angela Carter is brilliant on doing that. And also, it needs to be said, and this is rather, in a way, rather peculiar. But right from the beginning, right from the late 18th century, there have been a very large number, proportionately, of female authors. Now, some of those authors, like Radcliffe, you would never consider as feminist. I mean, Radcliffe was a conservative to the last degree. But Gothic appears to be, or have become, a space which gives room for female experience. And there's been an awful lot of critical work on female Gothic, from Ellen Mears onto Gubar and Gubar, and can't remember the name of her collaborator now. Anyway, a lot of female critics who've written about the female Gothic. I find that interesting and problematic in one way, because I think to separate out the female Gothic when the Gothic has arguably from its origins been at least 50% of female mode, I think it's just about a way of speaking of it, really. I prefer to think of Gothic as an area where there are male and female sensibilities at work, and they change around, they move around in terms of individual authors, but also in terms of cultural changes. For example, to take Dracula, then obviously from one point of view, Dracula is a novel about vampires, but from another, it's a novel about the phenomenon known in the closing years of the 19th century as the new woman, the woman who was taking on power and responsibility for herself. And the Count can be seen as a kind of archaic figure who is trying to fight against female power, and of course, in the end, fails. I mean, Dracula doesn't succeed. I mean, not quite sure what success would mean for Dracula. I mean, just going on living and sucking blood and becoming a bit older each year, I suppose. But that's not the narrative. The narrative is that Dracula has to be defeated.
Yeah. I think just going off something you mentioned there, I think another text to throw into the mix is also Shakespeare. Going back to Shakespeare again, is also Macbeth as well. You know, at this sense of, you say that female power can't be touched, and of course you've got the three witches. You know, fair is foul, foul is fair, and you know, there's a big critical. Well, I remember doing my A levels, but we had this big journal, and there was a lot of stuff in there saying that the witches are the driving force of this play. This play wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the witches. They are crafting all this, and I think there's a very good legitimacy to that. And of course, you got Lady Macbeth as well, which some critics call the fourth witch, or it's been suggested anyway. You know, her power is undeniable, and again, that supernatural instincts that come in drive Macbeth to go and kill Duncan. Spoiler, goes to kill Duncan, and and to become king and essentially lose his mind. You know, the slaughter of the Macduffs. You know, kills Banquo. Sees Banquo at the feast, sitting there in his chair. You know, there's a Gothic has, it's not saying women are bad at all. It's actually saying the opposite. You know, there are some powerful figures, particularly amongst the females, aren't there?
Yeah, yeah. Jungian analytic psychology speaks of the notion of anima.
Okay.
And anima is a kind of plurality, and a specifically feminine plurality. And so you get these recurrent images of women in groups, and especially threes, who are more powerful than the isolated male hero. You've got it in Macbeth's witches. You've got it in the fates, the three fates, the Norns, the three female Norns in Norse mythology, the Grey in Greek mythology, who have, if you recall, one eye and one ear between them. I can't remember how it works now, but the point about all this is that the female has the power of plurality. And in the end, that power of plurality is capable of overcoming the lonely male hero. You find, of course, in wonderfully comic terms, in one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, where you have the three witches. Was it Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Og, and Magrat? And Granny Weatherwax is all about herbs and healing and ancient village wisdom and so forth. Nanny Og is all about fertility. She has hundreds of children, and she's extremely, lewd in her behavior and in her speech. And poor Magrat, who's much younger, is a kind of Glastonbury witch who doesn't really know what she's doing, but she's joining on to the Wicca tradition, you know. So it's but of course, sorry, those are comic novels, but the issue about female power is extremely serious. And I think that Gothic has given space for that to be discussed, but imaged, I think, down the centuries. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Just thinking about you talked a lot about horror and terror, and you say that slashers, like these like horrifically gory films, they're not Gothic at all. So what's the difference in your estimation between horror and terror when it comes to this genre?
Well, let me just say that I don't think I've ever said that anything is not Gothic at all.
Oh, no, just saying.
I know, but I think the question of what is Gothic, I mean, it is a huge one and changes all the time. But yes, the distinction between horror and terror, which was first made, again, way back in the late 18th century. I think it's mainly to do with physical and psychological. That horror is about the body, and much of Gothic is about the body. It's about our fears of what might happen to the body being damaged or mutilated. And terror is more about menace, about our ideas as to what might happen. Another way of putting the distinction, maybe the most important one, is that terror has a great deal to do with the supernatural.
Yeah.
And horror doesn't need to be supernatural. It's about what we do to each other, the violence we inflict on each other. And now I've touched on the supernatural, maybe I could just go on about that just for a minute.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, please do.
I mean, obviously, one of the key things about the Gothic is the supernatural. Now, in the early Gothic, there's a distinction that's drawn between the explained supernatural in the novels of Anne Radcliffe. Then Emily, our heroine, thinks that she's seeing ghosts and skeletons and so forth. But in the end, they're all explained. They're just, she's just been exaggerated. It's just been deluded. Whereas in Matthew Lewis, writing in response to Radcliffe, then the threat of hell and demons are real. So there is something supernatural. And one way of looking at Gothic as it's developed has been in terms of that placing of the supernatural. The Gothic has to do with ghosts. It has to do with spirits. It has to do with phantoms. And all of that, I think, you can think of as the Gothic's preoccupation with transgression. So that those figures of the ghost, the phantom, the spirit, the spectre, they transgress the boundary between life and death. Much as Victor Frankenstein tries to commit an act of transgression by creating by making a creature and thus transgressing natural boundaries and also transgressing onto the role of God. And I think that if you were to look for one key to Gothic over the whole period of its development, I think one word, I think the word I would use would be transgression, between the boundaries of the natural and the supernatural, the human and the divine, and of course, boundaries between the genders and between the human and the other animal. And I'm thinking there especially of H.G. Wells's wonderful short novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau, where it speaks of a so-called doctor who seems to be damaging animals. Used to be called vivisection. We talk about it now as laboratory animals and so forth. But in fact, what he's really doing is trying to bring the animal up to the level of the human. But whatever he's trying to do, it involves a lot of pain. And it's obviously not a very good idea because he's transgressing a boundary which he should never be trying to transgress. He's trying to play God.
Yeah. And one thing we talked a lot about with Frankenstein was he tries to play God. He tries to build a man in his own image, essentially, which is what he does. I always find it interesting how Shelley, she never tells us how he did it. There's only one line in it which says, "I gathered the instruments of life around me," and that's it. And the next thing you know, oh look, here's a man, and it's like, well, how did you do it? But just a quick side note on that. I think she wrote it on. I think my memory serves me correctly. She was at a house, I think, and it was in the middle of a thunderstorm, and it was like a game amongst people. She's only 19 when she wrote it as well, wasn't she? And they were all daring each other to write the scariest story which they could. So this happened off the cuff, just one late night, as we were talking about earlier, the weather, lightning, the thunder and everything, and how that fed into a creative process, which is interesting. And I think another message of Frankenstein, this is mentioned with Daniel Boyle and Nick Dear, who did the National Theatre show a few years ago, that by Victor playing God and everything, it also sends another message, which is to say that, God doesn't play a big part in our rationality of things and everything. Man is capable of that. But also when a man does play God, it's almost the wrath and the repercussions of that are, they're just unfathomable. They're it's death, it's life just being destroyed before your eyes. It's bad. It's bad,
Yeah. Yes, the house where Mary Shelley was staying with Percy Shelley and Byron and Dr. Polidori was the Villa Diodati, wasn't it?
Mm.
The same evening uh, uh, gave birth to the first vampire story in English.
Ah.
Um, John Polidori, who was Byron's personal physician and was staying there, he also responded to the challenge and wrote a story called The Vampire, which comes long before Dracula. But of course that it raises interesting issues about where things begin, and I think Gothic always does that because after all, the Gothic is called Gothic after the Goths. Now the
Mm.
Goths are were a tribe of from what is now Germany, a Germanic tribe, who are only really well known for their role in the demolition of Rome at the end of the Roman Empire, along with the Huns and the Vandals. And I don't think that anybody in the 18th century knew much more than that about the Goths, really.
Yeah.
They only left one literary work, a poem written in Latin by a Romanized Goth, which is a rather funny, not intentionally funny, but rather interesting poem. It spends all its time saying, it wasn't us Goths what did it, it was them Huns and Vandals. So it's not a very illuminating poem. But the point is that trying to find the origin of Gothic is never simple. You can go
Yeah.
right back to the Goths, you can go to Horace Walpole in the 18th century, you can talk about medieval cathedrals, that often referred to as being in Gothic style, and Gothic as an architectural term coined in the 19th century, but referring to buildings put up in maybe the 12th to 14th centuries. So historically, Gothic is extraordinarily complex. And I think in that respect, it refers to our own human uncertainty about our own origins. Where did things begin? And you can see that, of course, simply at an individual developmental level. I mean, when we look back at our childhoods, what are our first actual memories?
Mm.
Or what memories do we have which are what Freud calls screen memories, memories implanted by our parents and other people, which over the years we've come to regard as our own memories?
Mm.
This might seem to be getting a bit fantastical, but I do
No,
think
go
that
for it.
I think the Gothic does have something to do with our own sense of not being fully in control. And that involves not being fully in control of our own pasts, and of how we got to be where we are. Yeah, and I think that the history of Gothic does reflect that kind of uncertainty. It's not about traditional history, which tries to recover and reevaluate real life events from the past. It's a kind of fantasized reconstruction of history, in which we can never fully know what the truth is. Because I think that Gothic recognizes that when we look at our own pasts, then what we're really doing is not fully recapitulating that past, but we're telling our own stories, we're telling
Mm.
our own narratives. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think I remember one like the key messages you get from certain Gothic novels, like don't play God or, you know, all that kind of thing. I remember my teacher at the time, I can't remember her name, but she said that the key, well, her taking away from Dracula in particular was, these are her words, not mine, a fear of foreigners. And of,
Yeah, well,
yeah, what did you say to that?
yes, yes. Well, there is that too. I mean, there's no point pretending that Gothic, or the older Gothic anyway, is politically correct according to our 21st century terms. I mean, it
Yeah.
isn't. I mean, with the early Gothics like Radcliffe and Lewis, you have tremendous stereotyping of the foreign, especially the Southern European, and also of, for example, Catholicism, which is a kind of hate object for the early Gothics.
Mm.
So I think that what one has to say is that Gothic, it doesn't reflect, but it refracts its own time. It has its own prism, but contemporary concerns and contemporary prejudices will always be there in the Gothic. Although what the Gothic does often try to do, I think, is to shift those prejudices so that they are things of the past, things that we can look back at and inspect and think, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. So to come back to your example of fear of foreigners in Dracula, I think that is certainly there. But just to use one maybe rather trivial example, but maybe not, one of the crew of light who kill off Dracula is, of course, American. It's never quite one thing nor the other. The Gothic looks backwards, but it also, I think, looks forwards. And one of the other things about Dracula, may be important to say, and I'm sure that your teacher would have mentioned this as well, is that though it now looks, as we look back upon it, as very much a period piece of the late 19th century, and of course it is that, nevertheless, at the time, it seemed amazingly modern because it uses all these means of modern technology, typewriters, telegraph, amazing means of communication. To us now, of course, archaic, but at the time they were cutting edge, and Dracula didn't seem like an old-fashioned novel at all.
No, it was ahead of its time.
It was,
yeah, incredibly so. You talked also about particularly, you've done like a series of online lectures specifically about Dracula, and you talk about the use of blood in Dracula. So what's your fascination with Dracula and blood?
Well, I think we have to remember that the Count, in almost all film representations of Dracula, bears no relation to the description in the text. The description in the text, you'll remember, is of an old man with white hair and long flowing moustaches, an old aristocrat.
Right.
Nothing like Christopher Lee at all. That's interesting in itself. But I think the point of that is that in the novel, the Count regards himself as the last representative of an ancient dynasty. He speaks about the Draculas having been in Eastern Europe for centuries, mainly fighting the Turks. Because, I mean, another thing about Dracula is that actually it's a kind of weird defense of Christianity, but leaving that aside. So the Count sees himself as the last representative of an ancient bloodline. And that's one meaning of the word blood. The blood is what flows through the veins of successive generations of aristocrats. So you have blood in that sense. Of course, oddly enough, one of the uses we still seem to have for it is in terms of horse breeding, where we talk of bloodstock. It's interesting, really. Anyway, that's on the side. So you have blood in that sense, and then you have blood in the more literal sense. And I suppose the situation with Dracula is about the interaction between the two, because he seems to need literal blood in order to keep his metaphorical bloodline going. And that, I think, is one of the central tropes of Dracula. And I think of all vampirism. You find it again in Anne Rice's long series of vampire novels, where the sucking of blood is essential to keep the line, the heritage going. So I think that's that crucial ambivalence of blood, I think, is what interests me.
Yeah, and it's like blood is like an energy source as well, and of course, with a lot of people say that people have vampiric qualities, but like, which they suck energy out of you, or you have peace around a certain person, and then someone with that energy can come and just sort of take it away or make you feel a little bit uneasy in a way. And I think there's a real kind of aura about energy and life force, and just it makes the fundamental cogs of being alive, I think, is also, I mean, an integral part of many genres, but especially in the Gothic. Do you think?
Yes, the blood is the life. Yeah, I think I have also read, but I'd be very happy to be corrected on this, but I think I've also read that around the time that Stoker was writing Dracula, medical advances had begun to suspect that there were different types of blood. What are they called? Alpha, whatever, and O, some, these
O
different blood.
positive, yeah,
Yeah, that
AB
type of thing.
negative, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think that aspect of science was beginning to be understood about those years. I think I could be wrong about that. But if that is true, then it just suggests that there was a real medical interest in blood and in blood transfusion, and
Mm.
possibly why blood transfusion did sometimes seem to work and other times seem to kill the person the blood was being given to. And
Yeah,
that's an interesting thought, isn't it? That sometimes the blood is the life and sometimes the blood is the death.
yeah,
If you receive blood, then that can be fine. But if you lose blood, you die of blood loss, then, I mean, we have to have a certain amount of blood. Um,
yeah.
Speaking of that wonderful old Tony Hancock sketch, The Blood Donor,
Mm.
where Hancock agrees to give blood. When they tell him how much, he says, really? That's almost an armful. The joke being that he doesn't understand that the blood circulates, which we have known for some time.
Sometime, yes, sometime, yeah. It sort of brings me on to, I just got a question down here in a way. This might not be of particular resonance now, but it says, how does, in your estimation, like, how does Stoker use the Gothic, and so he has his own? Well, I was sort of thinking, does he have a unique stamp on this genre where you look at the Gothic and you go, that's a Bram Stoker Gothic trait? Obviously you've got the vampire, but obviously there's more to it than that. I mean, does he have a unique stamp on this genre, as does people like Mary Kelly and the Brontes and stuff?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question because Stoker wrote, I think it was about 9 novels.
Hmm.
Um, Dracula is very different from the others. Firstly, because it's much, much bigger. I mean, Dracula, as you know, is quite a long novel,
It's
very
big.
substantial.
It's big.
All the others are much shorter. Um, the other difference is that Dracula is, at least in my opinion, and I think of that and many others, a very good novel. It's very accomplished, it's very well written, it's extremely gripping.
Yeah.
His other novels are terrible. Um, I mean, the Lair of the White Worm, well, you can gather how good that is by its title.
Yeah. The White
That's
Worm.
awful. And The Lady of the Shroud is also a terrible novel.
Yeah.
So, I um, uh, so Dracula is not typical of Stoker. I think Dracula is a kind of is a one-off. Um, I do think it's an amazing novel. I think it's very well written. I think it's very fully characterized, which none of his other novels are at all. I think it deals quite delicately with issues of life and death and transgression. So I'd hesitate to say that Stoker himself has a kind of authorial signature in the
Hmm.
Gothic. Certainly, Dracula is an extraordinary novel. I think, I don't know. I mean, it may be. I mean, we come across a lot of novelists these days who write. I do anyway. Who write one fantastic novel,
Yeah.
and the publisher says we need more like this, and we'll give you 6 months. And what comes out is rubbish. I mean, and I'm sorry to say that, but I think it does happen with a number of
Yeah,
writers.
yeah, that's true.
And I think it may have happened with Stoker, actually, either because his publishers pressurized him or because he himself felt, I've had this great success. I must now write some others like it, but he didn't have it in him.
Yeah,
And maybe it's sometimes like that with writers. I mean, maybe sometimes they only have one compelling novel. Nothing wrong with that.
yeah.
It's a magnificent achievement. Why do people feel you have to repeat it and go on in the same old way? Sometimes it just can't be done. So that's not quite answering your question, but that's my
No,
that's
no,
my
absolutely,
my view of Stoker. No,
absolutely.
you could also go another way with it and say what some critics have said, which is that Dracula was Bram Stoker's way of dealing with his uh, imaginative fascination with Henry Irving, for whom, as you know, he worked, the great stage actor and director.
Yeah,
He needed to somehow get all of that into some kind of imaginative form. But after that, he'd run out of things that really, really obsessed him, as it were. And he was just really writing to a kind of Gothic formula. That
mm.
I think is really true. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's sort of touch on this is one of the things I talked to you about sort of before today, which was you know you're at the University of Bristol. You've dealt with a lot of students. A lot of them sort of come up and ask you loads and loads of questions. So what would you say, like, for anyone who's listening or watching to this, who's again looking at the Gothic, or at A level, GCSE, university level, PhD, whatever level it is? What are some of the most frequently asked questions of yourself? And I know you sort of divided it into kind of two categories. One was one was historical, and the other one was something more about the practicality of it. I mean, am I getting that right? So what's some of the most frequently asked questions of yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think the most frequently asked question is what is it reasonable to refer to as Gothic?
Mm,
And I think that in a way is the most difficult one, because
mm,
um, in its most limited sense, Gothic is clearly a form that belongs to the past. It's a form that belongs to the 18th and 19th centuries.
mhm,
Um, in its broader form, then, as we can see, it continues to the present day. If we consider the Gothic to be a way of referring to works of writing and art, and now especially film and related media, then a lot of that work still rephrases but still uses Gothic tropes and Gothic formulae.
mm,
So I would say that Gothic does continue to the present day. And so if you feel it's right to refer to a writer like, say, Stephen King, who is one of my favorite writers,
yeah.
then I think that you can refer to him as Gothic because it's quite obvious in his works that he's read the Gothic, he's thinking with the Gothic, he's using the Gothic in various ways. Now, that is also interesting to me because critics of American literature in particular
Mm,
uh, seem to have been asking for decades, where is the great American novel? Why is nobody producing the great American novel?
mm,
And my answer is simple. You're looking in the wrong direction. Stephen King is already producing the great American novel. He's written about 40 of them now.
yeah.
The reason I say that is not because I think that King is the greatest writer ever, um, but because he is intent on capturing something of the essence of Central American life. There's no one like King for portraying the small American town.
Mm,
He has every character in detail. He has the speech patterns in detail. He has the conversations as though he's photographed them.
Yeah.
It's a representation of American life. But the reason why no one wants to think that King is doing that is because King is classified as a genre novelist. He's classified in the genre of horror.
Mm.
And so those labels, horror and the Gothic and so forth, although they're capacious, they also carry a certain penalty, as though you can't be so you can't be a writer in that genre and still be a great writer.
Mm.
But I think, sorry, to say one more thing about that, it is
Yeah.
obviously also quite frightening that King can, on the one hand, depict central, normative, realistic American life in that way, while at the same time bring into it continuingly an element of the supernatural.
Yeah.
And I think that shows how scared we continue to be about the possibilities of the supernatural, because it seems to me that it may be true that despite all technological advances and despite all cultural and social changes, we are still as scared of ghosts as we were in medieval times.
Mm.
I don't know how you would go about proving that, but we are creatures who are, for anthropological reasons, scared of the dark and
Yeah.
what might appear in the dark.
Mm.
And in the Gothic, mostly things are dark. And I read somewhere some little while ago that one of the features of most dreams is that in dreams the world tends to be darkened. It's not
Mm.
as vivid, not as clear, not as light as it is in real life. And I
Yeah.
bet that that is probably true. And so there's a linkage there between the darkness, the dream, the return of the ghost, and through the return of the ghost, the return of all that which which has been repressed. To go back to your previous point about repression.
Yeah, yeah. It's very true. You don't see a Gothic film where you don't read a Gothic text and there's a lot of sunlight.
No, I mean,
No.
some Gothic films I watch these days, I can barely see at all. Actually,
Yeah.
everything's happening in strict darkness. I've been watching the wonderful TV series The Witcher, which I
Yes.
think is probably Gothic.
Mm.
But my word, I mean, about halfway through, I discovered that everything's happening in so much darkness that I have to sort of rely upon subtitles to work out what's going on.
Just turn the brightness up a bit, guys. But no, it's interesting. In terms of let's think, what else have we got here? So Gothic, not a separate category. Yeah, so we sort of touched on that already. So the Gothic being like not its of its own category, it kind of falls into its own dark fantasy, which is not quite that, but it does have a uniqueness to it more than anything. A lot of people say it's similar to, like you were talking there with Stephen King about him being, oh, he's a horror writer, therefore Gothic is horror. It's like, well, in a way, sort of yes, but it is of its own unique standpoint, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think Gothic can convey and always has conveyed lots of different messages, but in a particularly Gothicized or maybe darkened format. I mean, sometimes people speak of horror and Gothic and indeed fantasy as being escapist.
Mm.
I I don't think I don't understand what's meant by escapism in that sense. I mean, everything we read or see on film or on TV can't be a full escape. It has something to do with real life and the real world that we're inhabiting. The question is not whether it's portraying that world. The question is how it's portraying it. It's always portraying it in one way or another.
Yeah.
It may be displaced in time or in space. If you think of science fiction, without going into detail at all, but I mean, everything in science fiction has some relation to the world that we know and experience. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand it, and there'd be no point in writing it. What science fiction can do and does do is exaggerate, tendencies in the world in which we live.
Mm.
uh, it makes them seem as though they are in some way distance from us. But they're actually, the preoccupations remain the same. So I think that Gothic, and again I come back to Angela Carter, I think that Gothic is well able to provide us with social commentary, but it does it through metaphor, it does it through changes of language and so forth, rather than through a kind of direct approach.
Yeah.
Back again to Wuthering Heights. I mean, Wuthering Heights seems to be pretty much fantastical in one sense, in that the passion that Cathy feels and that Heathcliff probably feels seems almost otherworldly. But it's set in this intensely realistic setting in the Yorkshire moors, and also it's dealing in emotions which I think many people feel or have felt, but don't dare to portray in such a strenuous way.
Yeah, amazing. Do you think, again, this might be a bit of a silly question, but do you think the Gothic does it mean to scare, or is that like a nice side effect, do you think?
Oh, I think that the early Gothic certainly meant to scare, or maybe put the reader in a position where she or he felt a pang of uncertainty or anxiety as to what would happen next. Now, in fairness, most narrative puts us in that position, but I think Gothic does it in a more definite way. Yeah, I think that there was an intention there to disturb. I think I would say, rather than necessarily scare. Yeah, and certainly Gothic film. Well, I was going to say Gothic film is designed to scare. Think example of Polanski's Repulsion, which is, I think, a very scary film indeed. And there are so many others. But if you think of Hammer horror films, I don't think they are meant to scare us. I think they're meant to show us images of the fears of other people and allow us as an audience to feel comforted that we are not in those situations, that we don't take them to be real.
Yeah.
So I think I use this phrase in the literature of terror. I think there's a dialectic in Gothic between disturbance and comfort. I think that we are meant to be disturbed up to a certain point, but obviously not beyond that point, or things would get out of hand. And besides, can images, whether literary or visual, really scare us into madness? Or are we meant to be brought back into a more sane world at the end of the experience? Now, that touches on a very complicated and difficult question about the social effects of horror films, and probably recall the way in which the attempt was made to show that those horrible murders, now known as the Bulger murders, in which a small child was killed by two other children, many attempts were made to show that the horror film series called Child's Play had some influence on those events.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult argument to deal with, I think. Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe you'd say that these very sad children were already disposed towards violence, so that somehow these films made it seem more possible. You might argue that. To argue that films and writings can be directly responsible for violent behaviour, I think, is a very difficult argument to make. Sorry, I'm getting off the point now, but it is quite important, I think. I mean, remember, back in the States in the mid 20th century, then huge controversy about comics and whether comics could encourage violent and antisocial behavior.
Mhm.
And a comics code was drawn up, which all producers of comics had to adhere to show they weren't, I suppose, a precursor of our current film classification system.
Mm.
Uh, and we still do that. We're obviously still a bit worried that certain kinds of, well, are we worried that certain kinds of film might produce imitative behavior, or that they might make too big an impression on young minds? It's really difficult because it is certainly true. Well, it's true for me that some images I have seen on film in my life
Mm.
remain with me. That doesn't mean I go out and act on what I've seen there. But it is also true that some images are very, very difficult to erase, aren't they, from your memory, and they
Yeah.
remain with you. And therefore they remain somehow on the field of life's possibilities that you're entertaining. And I think that is very difficult.
Mm.
But I suppose I would have to say that it's a problem, but not one that can be solved through censorship. I suppose that's the important thing.
Yeah. Great stuff. I'm thinking more about, if you were, this is a bit of a crazy thought now, but if you were put into like a situation like, like Frankenstein or like the guys in Dracula, and yeah, I'm just thinking like this is a very, very weird question, so just bear with me. But if you're put in these situations, do you think how would you respond, you personally as David, respond to the surroundings that you were in? Like you're in the monastery, you're in the castles with the dripping stone walls and everything, and you're in the world which you've been looking at for so long. I mean, what would your feelings be like? How would you feel in those Gothic environments? You're not reading it on the page; you're actually in it. How do you think it would make you feel?
Well, I think that well, I think I'd feel terrified.
Mm.
But also, of course, we all now have the opportunity to decide that for ourselves by playing Gothic video games.
Oh, that as well, yeah.
Silent Hill, for example, which I played for a bit, and that scared the life out of me, so I stopped playing it.
So yeah, there you go. This has been great, man. Thank you so much for this. I'm just thinking about just to do a couple more questions for you, David, and then we just sort of finish. What does it stand for? What does goth? I mean, in your estimation, things are. Everyone's got their own definition of things, like of literature. Everyone's got an idea. Everyone's got a point to make. Everyone's opinions are so unique. But you think Gothic in particular, and we touched on this on many occasions today, but just if there is something new we could bring to this, um, what do you think this genre stands for? What do you think, in your estimation, what does Gothic stand for?
I think there are three things I mentioned there. One of them I mentioned already, and that is about transgression, transgressing the boundaries between the divine and the human, and all sorts of other boundaries. That's the first thing. Uh, the second thing is I think that Gothic has a great deal to do with the body. I know I drew a distinction just now between horror and terror,
Hmm.
but I think actually wherever you are in Gothic, there are anxieties about the vulnerability of the body. Whether that's a ludicrous extreme like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or whether it's about Gothic heroines rushing about fearing violation and so forth. I think that anxiety about the vulnerability and fragility of the body is always there. And the third thing I would say, which we haven't touched on, is I think that the Gothic has a lot to do with what I would call the outlaw. Now, with the early Gothic villains, although we reprehend their attempts to control and violate uh, women and sometimes their servants and whatever, nonetheless, our sympathy is often quite divided.
Hmm.
Uh, now, one of the things that one of the immediate successors to the Gothic
Yeah.
was the melodramatic theatre of the early Victorian period, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, um, where you had this emerging tradition of the moustache twirling Gothic villain on stage,
Hmm.
ancestor of the pantomime villain, which endures to the present day. Um, and I think audiences, although they would shout and boo the villain,
Hmm.
nonetheless meant to find him in some way attractive.
Hmm.
So a certain sympathy with the outlaw, with the person who is not obeying the law, which carries over into Dracula, where the Count is not simply regarded as an evil villain, I think, but by most readers and watchers of the films is seen as a rather attractive possibility
Hmm.
for how life might be. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, it's not. In the end, he's not viable. Dracula is not viable as part of the world as we experience it.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we don't feel an attraction for him as time goes on. So I think that the attractive villain, the outlaw, is important in the Gothic because it suggests to us the possibilities of how we might live our lives if we were not bound by the law and by social convention.
Hmm.
I think that's an important aspect. Um, as though that person represents the untrammeled self that we might be
Hmm.
if we could live in a way that was entirely true to our own desires. But we know we can't do that because our desires, as well as being productive, are also destructive.
Hmm.
And it's not possible for society to live in that way. So we know we can't do it, but we can imagine it. We can imagine what it would be like. And I think the Gothic connects with some of those fantasies of how life could be lived.
Yeah, there's like there's a message in there that can help. Like I think in all literature, there's a message that can help us sort of be better in a way to sort of show what we did wrong before, and now we've got the chance to correct it in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, or at the very least be different. I think
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. This is brilliant stuff. David, this has been a really, really great chat. I've really, really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for this. Just two more questions for you today. What's next for you on the poetry front?
Oh, uh, I'm not quite sure to be honest. I'm thinking of gathering together another collection of my political poems.
Mhm.
After the first one I published about 3 years ago, and in the meanwhile, I'm uh, I'm writing as I think fit. I've begun to write a longish poem on the topic of the Roman Emperor Heliogabalus.
Mm.
Not very well known, possibly because he became emperor at the age of 14 and was killed at the age of 22 by the Romans.
Right.
But he's an interesting figure because he was brought up in what is now Syria, and he was brought up as an aristocrat who thought he was the sun god. He was brought to Rome to take the throne the emperorship,
Yeah.
and he was never quite certain what gender he was. He was possibly trans in some sense, and he was, I think, probably almost completely mad, whatever that means.
Mm.
And so I find him a rather interesting figure. I said to a fellow poet not long ago that I was writing a poem on this little known Roman emperor, and he gazed at me and he said ironically, "Go with it. The world needs more of those." And I thought maybe the world doesn't need a long poem on little known Roman emperors. So it may be, Oliver, that this will never see the light of day, but I'm enjoying writing it.
Excellent. Well, that's the important thing. As long as you're enjoying it and you feel good about it, that's the whole thing that matters. Brilliant. And just to finish, last question for every guest, which is, what's been an experience or experiences you've had in your career up to this point that you're never ever going to forget?
Oh, um, I remember a couple of years ago turning up at a conference of the International Gothic Association in Dublin, and a colleague from India staring at me across the room, and eventually coming up to me and saying, "David Punter, I thought you were dead."
Oh, right.
Oh, can I mention one more thing, though, Oliver?
Yeah, of course.
What I have been doing recently is helping a friend who's a film and TV director to make a series of TV programs called Wonderlands Gothic, and it's coming onto your screens sometime in the autumn. So may I just mention that it will be,
Yeah.
I think, worth watching. His name is Adrian Munsey, and he made a wonderful series a couple of years ago about children's authors, just called Wonderlands, and this is a successor to that. So I thought I'd give that a quick plug.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Plug it. Plug. What
Well,
is
you
your...
mentioned my website, haven't you? So yes,
I
just to
have,
repeat
yes,
that.
yes. Yes, it's
Yeah.
down below in the description. People are able to access it. What was your response, by the way, to that? It's to your colleague coming over. I thought you were dead. What did you say?
Oh, well, I think I said not yet.
Right. I mean, what an odd thing to say. What an odd thing to say.
Oh
Well,
no, perhaps that was a bit too puzzling. I think that she'd read uh, the Literature of Terror, and I did publish it in 1980, and
right.
so I think she thought I probably was older than I actually am.
Well, well, how wrong was she? And there you were.
Oh, how long was she? And then we gave each other a big hug and celebrated life.
There you go. That's what it's all about. Brilliant. David, once again, thank you so much for today. This has been a really enlightening conversation, and just hearing like everything you know about the Gothic, it's just been amazing. And you've taken me right back to the A-level days, and to make me feel very, the word escapes me. What's the word? Nostalgic and very, yeah, it's been nice to go over an old topic again, which I've really enjoyed talking about today as well as before. And yeah, I look forward to the poetry coming out again and what else you continue to do. And it's going to be great. If you just hang on, I'll finish the recording and I'll say goodbye to your one-to-one. But yeah, what a great place to end. So guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been the Uncensored Critic podcast, and I'll be back very soon. And once again, David, thank you, sir.